Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Happy New Year.
You know what day it is.
It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday, which means it's time for another episode of the Problem Tenant Chronicles.
Ooh, I love this one.
Before we get started, let's give a big shout out to our sponsors for making this deep dive possible. Flowers and Associates Property Rentals and Robert Flower's exciting new book. I've heard it's really good.
Yeah, I hear it's a must-read for anyone interested in real estate.
It's called Real Estate Investment Strategies for Beginners, the Basics of Renting and Wholesaling. So if you're looking to maybe dip your toes into real estate or level up your landlord game, give Robert a call at 901-445-8148.
Yeah, he's a wealth of knowledge.
Now, today we're tackling a topic that can make even the most seasoned landlord shudder: problem tenants.
Oh boy, yeah.
We've got some real-life scenarios pulled from pasted text that highlight the kinds of challenges landlords face, and we'll discuss some proactive steps you can take to protect yourself. So, first up, imagine you start getting complaints from other tenants about strange smells and noises coming from one apartment. You investigate, and it turns out your tenant has a secret menagerie of exotic pets. We're not talking about an extra goldfish here. Think illegal reptiles, maybe even exotic cats.
You know, it's surprising how often landlords kind of overlook the importance of clear language in their lease agreements when it comes to pets. Like, you need to be really specific.
Yeah.
A vague pet policy can open the door to all sorts of unexpected situations.
I bet. But isn't it hard to enforce a pet policy if a tenant says their pet is an emotional support animal? I mean, where do you draw the line?
That's a great question. And it's an area where landlords need to be super careful. While landlords are generally required to make reasonable accommodations for emotional support animals, they're not required to allow animals that pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others or that would cause significant damage to the property.
So what's the best way for a landlord to handle a situation where a tenant claims their exotic pet is an emotional support animal? What do they do?
Well, documentation is key. The landlord should request documentation from the tenant's healthcare provider that supports the need for the animal. This documentation should clearly state the animal's therapeutic function and how it alleviates the tenant's disability.
Okay, so clear documentation is crucial. But what if the documentation checks out? Does the landlord have any options if they're still concerned about, the animal safety or potential for damage?
In that case, the landlord could consider requesting additional information from the healthcare provider about the specific animal and its temperament, or they could consult with an attorney to explore potential options for mitigating risks.
This brings us to another important point: regular inspections. If a landlord suspects a tenant is, hiding unauthorized pets, wouldn't routine inspections help prevent the problem, or at least catch it early?
Absolutely. Regular inspections, conducted with proper notice to the tenant, can be a really valuable tool for landlords to ensure that tenants are complying with the terms of the lease agreement.
Makes sense. Now, let's move on to a scenario that's a little more intense. A tenant storing hazardous materials. Think, like flammable liquids, unknown chemicals, maybe even explosives. I mean, this is a situation that could have really serious consequences for everyone in the building.
You're absolutely right. This is an area where landlords need to be proactive and informed about local ordinances and safety regulations.
But wouldn't it be difficult to know what a tenant is storing in their unit, especially if it's like in a basement or a garage? I mean, can a landlord just barge in and start snooping around?
Well, while landlords do have a right to access their property for inspections, they need to respect tenants' right to privacy. A well-written lease agreement should include provisions for periodic inspections, specifying the purpose, notice required, and areas that will be inspected.
So let's say a landlord conducts an inspection and finds that a tenant has a stockpile of potentially hazardous materials. What happens then? What's the next step? Just tell them to get rid of it.
It's not quite that simple, unfortunately. The landlord needs to act carefully and follow proper procedures. The first step is to document the violation, taking photographs and detailed notes about the materials found. Then, the landlord should serve the tenant with a written notice, referencing the relevant lease clauses and local ordinances that prohibit the storage of such materials.
And if the tenant refuses to cooperate, what if they, say they need those materials for their work or a hobby?
That's where things can get a little tricky. The landlord may need to involve local authorities, such as the fire marshal or a hazardous materials team, to assess the situation and determine the right course of action.
Speaking of tricky situations, let's move on to a scenario that can be a real legal quagmire. Unregistered occupants or squatters. You think you have a responsible tenant, and then one day they're gone and someone else is living in the unit without your knowledge or consent.
Yeah, this is where the distinction between guests, authorized occupants, and unauthorized occupants becomes super important. A lease agreement should clearly define these terms and specify the procedures for adding occupants to the lease.
Okay, but let's be real. Most tenants probably don't, scrutinize their lease agreements that closely. So how can a landlord actually enforce those rules?
Regular communication and documentation are key. Landlords should make a point of reminding tenants about the occupancy rules during lease renewals or routine interactions. And if a landlord suspects unauthorized occupants, they should document any evidence, such as additional names on mailboxes or utility bills.
So what if a landlord discovers that someone is essentially squatting in their unit? Can't they just change the locks and kick them out?
Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Evicting someone, even if they're an unauthorized occupant, requires following specific legal procedures, including serving proper notices and potentially going through a court process.
This sounds like a situation where it's essential to have an attorney on speed dial.
Absolutely. Navigating eviction laws can be very complex, and having legal guidance can help landlords protect their rights and ensure they are following the correct procedures.
Okay, let's take a quick breather before we dive into our next problem tenant scenario. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We're ready to tackle more tales from the landlord trenches.
Yeah, let's jump right back in.
Before we do, I want to remind everyone that being a landlord isn't all sunshine and rent checks.
Definitely not.
It requires vigilance, knowledge, and a good dose of legal savvy.
Couldn't agree more. It's not enough to just own a property and collect rent. Landlords need to be proactive about protecting their investments and ensuring, a safe and harmonious living environment for all their tenants.
That's right. Speaking of potential disruptions, our next scenario is one that many landlords have probably encountered: the unlicensed daycare or business. Imagine your quiet residential property suddenly turned into a bustling, hub of activity with kids running around or clients coming and going all the time.
It's a situation that can create a lot of tension between tenants and landlords. On one hand, tenants may feel they have a right to use their rental unit for, personal or entrepreneurial stuff. But on the other hand, landlords have a responsibility to uphold the terms of the lease and to protect the interests of all the tenants.
Okay, but isn't it a bit, overreaching to tell tenants they can't run a small business from their apartment? What if they're just selling crafts online or, tutoring a few kids?
Well, that's where lease agreements need to be super specific. It's not about, stifling tenants' entrepreneurial spirit or anything. It's about setting clear boundaries and expectations. A well-written lease should explicitly state what types of business activities are permitted, if any, and outline any restrictions, like maybe there are limits on client visits or noise levels, things like that.
So let's say a tenant ignores the lease and starts operating an unlicensed daycare.
Oh, boy.
Or a busy hair salon.
Mm-hmm.
What steps can a landlord take to address the situation?
Well, first things first, the landlord needs to gather evidence of the unauthorized business activity. This could include photos of signage, increased traffic, maybe even testimonials from other tenants who have been affected by the noise or disruption.
But wouldn't confronting the tenant directly, lead to a confrontation? It seems like a tricky situation to navigate.
You're right, it is. It's important to approach the situation diplomatically. The first step should always be a polite conversation. Remind the tenant of the lease terms and express your concerns about, the impact of the business on other residents. If the tenant is receptive, you might be able to work out a compromise, like maybe limiting operating hours or the number of clients allowed.
And if the tenant just isn't receptive to those suggestions, or they just keep operating the unlicensed business, what then?
In that case, the landlord might need to take, more formal action. This could include sending a written notice outlining the violation and demanding that the tenant stop the unauthorized business. If they still don't comply and keep ignoring the lease, the landlord might have grounds to start eviction proceedings.
It sounds like knowing local zoning laws and business licensing requirements is super important in these situations.
Absolutely. Landlords should familiarize themselves with the regulations in their area to determine if the tenant's business is even allowed in a residential zone. If it's not, the landlord could report the activity to the appropriate authorities, like maybe the city's code enforcement department.
Okay, before we wrap up our deep dive into all these problem tenant scenarios, let's take a look at some common questions we've received from listeners. These questions touch on some issues that a lot of landlords deal with on a regular basis. First up, we have a question from Sarah in California. Sarah asks, what can I do if a tenant consistently violates the no smoking policy in their lease? Secondhand smoke can be really annoying for other tenants, and it can damage the property too.
You're right, enforcing a no-smoking policy can be a real challenge, especially in multi-unit buildings where smoke can easily travel between apartments. Clear communication and documentation are key in this situation.
So walk us through the steps a landlord should take if they find out a tenant is smoking in a non-smoking unit.
The first step is to remind the tenant of the no-smoking policy in the lease agreement. This reminder should be in writing, and it should clearly state that continued smoking will result in, further action.
What if the tenant says they're only smoking outside on their balcony or patio? Is it still a violation?
It really depends on the specific language in the lease agreement. Some leases prohibit smoking anywhere on the property, including balconies and patios. Others might be more lenient. Landlords should check their lease agreements and make sure the language is clear and unambiguous.
Okay, so let's say the tenant gets the reminder, but they still smoke inside the unit. What's next?
Well, then the landlord could issue a more formal warning notice, outlining the consequences of further violations. Those consequences could include fines, the requirement for professional cleaning to get rid of smoke odors, or even the possibility of eviction if it keeps happening.
Okay, our next question is from John in New York. John wants to know, what can I do if a tenant is neglecting basic property maintenance, like yard work or keeping the unit clean?
This is another common issue. Leases typically outline tenants' responsibilities when it comes to property upkeep, and it's important for landlords to address any, breaches of these obligations.
So what's the best way to approach a tenant who isn't keeping up their end of the bargain when it comes to, maintenance and stuff?
It's really important to document any instances of neglect. Take pictures or videos as evidence. Then, the landlord should send a written notice to the tenant, explaining the specific maintenance issues that need to be fixed and referencing the relevant parts of the lease agreement. This notice should also give the tenant a reasonable amount of time to take care of the situation.
And what if the tenant just ignores the notice or, makes half-hearted attempts to fix things?
In some cases, landlords can hire a professional cleaning service or a landscaper to handle the issues and then deduct the cost from the tenant's security deposit. However, it's super important to check with an attorney to make sure you're complying with local laws regarding security deposit deductions.
This brings us to a more serious question. What if a tenant is doing illegal things on the property? This is a situation no landlord wants to deal with, but it's important to be prepared.
Definitely. Landlords need to act quickly and decisively in this kind of situation to protect themselves and their other tenants.
So let's say a landlord has a good reason to believe that a tenant is involved in, drug activity or something like that. What's the first step? Can they call the police right away?
If the landlord suspects illegal activity is happening and there's an immediate threat to safety, absolutely. They should call the police right away.
And what about talking to the tenant directly? Is that a good idea?
Once the police are involved and the immediate threat is addressed, the landlord should talk to an attorney to figure out the next steps. Many leases have clauses that allow for immediate eviction if the tenant is doing illegal stuff.
Okay, our last question is from Lisa in Florida. Lisa asks, what can I do if a tenant won't pay for utilities that are clearly their responsibility according to the lease? This can be a big financial headache for landlords.
Absolutely. This is a scenario that shows just how important it is to have a clear and detailed lease agreement. The lease should say exactly which utilities the tenant is responsible for and what the procedures are for dealing with non-payment.
So what are some practical steps a landlord can take if a tenant isn't paying their utilities?
First things first, send a written notice to the tenant reminding them of their responsibility and outlining the consequences of non-payment. The notice should include the amount owed and a reasonable deadline for payment.
What if the tenant ignores the notice or just refuses to pay? What options does the landlord have then?
Well, local laws vary, but in many cases, landlords can deduct unpaid utility charges from the tenant's security deposit or take legal action to recover the unpaid amount. In some places, unpaid utilities can even be treated like unpaid rent, which could lead to eviction.
Well, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring a wide range of challenges that landlords face.
Yeah, we have.
From exotic pets to hazardous materials to unlicensed businesses and everything in between, being a landlord can be a real roller coaster ride.
It definitely can be. But with the right knowledge, preparation, and a healthy dose of vigilance, landlords can navigate these challenges and protect their investments.
Before we wrap up this part of the Problem Tenant Chronicles, let's hear from our sponsors. Stay tuned, we'll be back with some final thoughts and insights. Welcome back to the deep dive for the final stretch of the Problem Tenant Chronicles.
I hope our deep dive has been helpful for you.
It's definitely been a wild ride, but I think we've given some pretty good advice for landlords dealing with or trying to prevent those problem tenant situations.
Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways for me is just how important it is to be informed. Knowledge is power.
So true. We've seen how, little oversights or unclear language in a lease can blow up into huge headaches. But being proactive, communicating well, and knowing your legal rights and responsibilities can make all the difference.
When you think about it, it all comes down to respect and understanding between landlords and tenants.
Right. And it starts with a good lease agreement. It's more than just a piece of paper. It's the foundation of a successful landlord-tenant relationship.
It should be clear, comprehensive, and specific to the property and local laws. It needs to cover everything: pet policies, maintenance responsibilities, the consequences of breaking the lease, how to resolve disagreements, all of it.
And don't just assume the tenant has read and understood every single detail of the lease.
No, take the time to go over the important parts with them, answer any questions they have, make sure everyone's on the same page from the start.
Talking about being on the same page, it's really important to keep those lines of communication open throughout the tenancy.
Absolutely. Regular communication can help prevent small issues from becoming big blowouts. Landlords should set up a clear way to communicate, whether it's through email, phone calls, or even a tenant portal, and encourage tenants to reach out with any concerns.
And let's not forget documentation.
Oh, that's huge. Keep records of everything: lease agreements, tenant applications, every conversation, inspection reports, maintenance requests, any notices you send.
Like building a case file just in case.
Exactly. If you ever need to take legal action or go through the eviction process, good documentation can be your saving grace.
Speaking of legal stuff, landlord-tenant laws can be pretty complicated and they're different everywhere.
That's right. So landlords should really familiarize themselves with the laws in their area, or even talk to a lawyer to make sure they're following the rules and protecting themselves.
That brings us to an important question for everyone listening. If you're a landlord, how can you stop these problem tenant situations from happening in the first place? And if you're a tenant, how can you make sure you're holding up your end of the deal and having a good relationship with your landlord? That's something to think about as we finish up this episode of the Problem Tenant Chronicles. Remember, knowledge is power, communication is key, and a solid lease agreement is the foundation of a successful rental experience. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Deep Dive. Huge shout out to our sponsors, Flowers & Associates Property Rentals and Robert Flowers' new book, Real Estate Investment Strategies for Beginners. Give Robert a call at 901-445-8148. We'll be back next Wednesday with another fascinating exploration. Until then, happy renting, everyone.